So here when we create a point object, we want to supply initial values for x and y coordinates, like this, 1 and 2. To achieve this, we need a constructor, which is a special method that is called when we create a new point object. Let me show you how to create a constructor. So, in our point class, we define a new function. The name of this function should be double underline, init, double underline. This is a special method that we call a magic method. In Python classes, we have several magic methods, and you're going to learn more about them throughout this section. So this magic method is called a constructor, and is executed when we create a new point object. Now, earlier I told you that all the methods that we define in a class should have at least one parameter, which we call self by convention. You will see what this is shortly. So we add self, and then optionally we add any additional parameters for initializing a point object, like x and y. Now, what is this self? Self is a reference to the current point object. For example, here on line 9, when we call the point class, Python will internally create a point object in memory and set self to reference that point object. Now, this point object has a bunch of methods that you have seen before. For example, when we use the dot operator, you can see all the methods in this point object. But an object can also have attributes, which are basically variables that include data about that object. For example, we can have attributes like x and y that we can easily print on the terminal. In other words, a class or an object bundles data and functions related to that data into one unit. Once again, as a metaphor, think of a human. A human can have attributes like eye color, height, weight, and so on, as well as functions like walk, talk, and so on. Okay? So, back to our constructor. You learned that self is a reference to the current object. So we can use that to set the x and y attributes, like this, self.x. We can set it to some default value like 0, or this x argument that we receive in this method. Similarly, let's set self.y to y. Now with this code, when we use the dot operator, look, we have the draw method as well as the two new attributes x and y. So we can simply print point.x on terminal. Let's take a look. Run this code. As you can see, x is 1. Now, back to our draw method. Here again, we have this self parameter. So using this, we have a reference to the current point object. And with that, we can read the x and y values and print them on the terminal. So here, I'm going to change this implementation and pass a formatted string like this. Point, parenthesis. Here, I want to pass self.x, then comma, and then self.y. So using self, we can read attributes of the current object, or we can also call other methods in this object. Now, let's change line 11 and simply call point.draw. Save the changes, run the program, and this is what we get. Now, what is interesting here is that when calling the draw method, we didn't have to supply a value for the self parameter because Python does that by default. Now, technically, we could come back here and pass this point object as a reference to the current object, but this is really unnecessary and it makes our code busy or noisy. So, here's what you need to take away. The methods that we define in a class should have at least one parameter, which by convention is called self. And this references the current point object that we're working with. When calling methods of an object, we never have to supply a value for this parameter. Python interpreter does that for us.